Lions Rock Productions.
This is Jay
This
Moore.
is Greg Proops.
This is Jordan Harbinger.
This is Dexter from The Offspring.
This is Nathan
This is
East.
Sebastian Younger.
This is Rick Marotta.
This is Stuart Copeland.
This is Mick Gillette.
This is Andy Summers.
Hey, this is Skunk Baxter.
This is Gabby Reese.
This is Rob Bell.
Hey, this is John Leon Guerrero.
Hey, and this is Pete A. Turner.
Hi, Pete. This is Rodrigo Nieto. I'm a professor at the Naval Postgraduate School. It's a pleasure to be here. Of course, all over the opinions I'll be expressed today are only mine. They're not those of my employer. But thank you for the opportunity.
And now, the Break It Down Show with John Leon Guerrero and Pete A. Turner.
Yeah, you're welcome on the Break It Down Show here. Hey, the thing I guess I wanted to discuss with you, but I want to let the audience understand is that you work at Naval Postgrad, but you've also worked with, I don't know if you're still with them, the Singularity University and a bunch of things. So when you talk about geopolitical, geostrategic, these kind of approaches, technology, etc., you're a man speaking from a pretty high platform. You're very comfortable at talking about this. And then for those that know the show already, and if you don't, hey, I'm Pete. I also have a lot of experience in combat zones, but from the ground level, right? And so we have this gap between where you see things and where you expert at, and where I see things and I expert at. And I think it'll be interesting to see if we can make some connections from top to bottom, because theory and practice, as we're seeing live right now in the Russian-Ukrainian conflict, is changing, and we're getting validation on a lot of things that are truly obsolete.
Yeah, I mean it's a scary but very interesting moment in time, right? So we're seeing the unfolding of a new era on top of an old one, as all geopolitical fractures. I mean, this is the challenge of taking control of what Mackinder used to talk as the world island. And this is not new. What is new is that in the post-Soviet space and after globalization, we thought that the idea of a imperial power rolling their armored battalions through the prairies of a neighboring country, that those were things that seemed almost quaint, right? And what we're seeing here is that they're not, and that great power competition is here with us to stay. And that what's different, though, is that the kinds of technologies that were available when this became an issue first, and what we have now available are very different, right? So just from a point of view of a tactical point of view, things are really, really, really different. And we can maybe talk a little bit about those differences that have to do with the use of exponential technologies at the same time that a new geopolitical balance of power.
And I want to say hey to Todd DeVoe, who's connected the two of us together. And Todd has his own capability to talk and has his own show about emergency management, which actually oddly overlaps in some way with what we're kind of talking about today and dealing with conflict and trying to figure these things out. When we look at the Russian-Ukrainian conflict, it is kind of quaint. I always say, the last place I'd want to be in a modern fight is inside of a tank.
Yeah.
And it's so... the ability of the tank to hit a target at a given distance is really kind of adorable that matters anymore, because really matters is that a bunch of nations without showing up physically can have a whole bunch of Javelin missiles show up, and RPG-3s and RKG-3s and all of these anti-tank things can be flown in to deal with that. But more importantly, and what really shows the level of complexity in modern conflict is a billionaire has a space network. And he can go, anybody can have the internet now, just like that. And that is something we've never dealt with before, where someone completely outside the sphere can say, here's open access to information. Now, we know there's a lot of disinformation, but here's a guy offering a platform to go up and out. That's completely, it used to just be the government. Like when we invaded in Iraq in 91, we turned all the satellite comms off. So if you weren't on our side, you were pushed back a couple hundred years in time. Now we're pushing people forward in time, and it's an outsider doing it.
Yeah, and so it's what's interesting here, and this has to do with some other trends that we've seen in military affairs, is that if you think about the state of military technology in the 1990 and 1980, so at the end of the Cold War, the last time we thought about this Russian-American conflict that we were seeing right now, it was a moment in time in which defense technology, the so-called military-industrial complex, was the tip of the spear of high technology, right? So the idea was that DoD and the military would have the most advanced weaponry and systems, and then what would trickle down to the civilian side of the equation will be a lesser variant, a lesser version of that technology, right? If you go to watch a movie from the 1980s, the military shows with the best toys, right? And it's always kind of this idea of, that's not true anymore, right? Off the shelf moves faster than military procurement. We see more advanced drone technology in Best Buy than the stuff that sometimes we are equipped with in the battlefield. And the same goes in this case for the development of, in this case, command and control technologies like the mega constellation that Starlink has put together that can flip the switch and activate a high bandwidth anywhere on the globe at this point, even though the constellation is not even finished yet. So they're still deploying satellites. And we see the arrival of many of these antennas that cannot be censored by the Russians as they gain control of the Ukrainian backbone, right? So off the shelf moves faster. So private actors, the Microsofts, the Googles, the Apples, the Starlinks, they have now capabilities we don't have in this side of the shop, but hopefully we can engage them as part of the American soft power and hard power in this country.
You know what's blowing my mind, Pete,
Go ahead, Todd.
and Rodrigo, is that we are seeing real time or close to real time satellite imagery being shared with the Ukrainians. That when I was in the military back in the Stone Age, that we had to be read into the conversation to be able to see that real time or close to real time satellite imagery. And now it's just on the internet, and they're sharing that 40 mile, whatever. I don't think it's quite 40 miles, but road of Soviet, said this, or I go back to the time, Russian military is being taken by a private satellite and being shared. So it's this, like, to Pete's point, is that there's no longer this whole thing where we could turn things off and to stop it. And there's another side of it which kind of concerns me as somebody who leans more on the libertarian side of politics, is the interesting enough is the ability for people to, like this, turn off all financial streams to everything that's happening. And that's kind of like, ooh, if they could, I agree what they're doing. I'm not disagreeing with the tactic, but they start thinking, oh, can we start doing that to private citizens? But that's a whole other story.
Well, but it is relevant, right? So during the last 30 years, since the fall of the Soviet Union and the Berlin Wall, part of the process has been a process of integrating the world in a system, in a global system, right? And there was a hypothesis here. The hypothesis was that as we build a stronger supply chains, as we trade with each other, we would create a level of interdependence that would make it harder for us to go to war. And what we're learning here is that it might have been the opposite, right? That as we integrated specifically China and Russia, our near-peer competitors, into this world economy, we gave them a platform so they could rebuild and actually multiply their force compared to where they were in the 1980s. Now, what we're doing now with this very aggressive economic sanctions, right? The imposition of SWIFT, and more importantly, the freezing of the fund of the funds that the central banking of Russia had outside of Russia, is a level of economic warfare that goes beyond anything that we've done to any other country on the planet, probably with the exception of Iran, right? So it is a moment in time that we're testing, as you're saying, if unplugging you from globalization, it's a painful enough punishment for a nation that it's, in this case, not just a nuclear power, but the other nuclear power, right? The other nuclear superpower.
I want to bring in another element of the democratization of combat, because, again, off the shelf, moving faster than the government, I can go acquire optics for my rifle that will allow me to reliably touch a man-sized target 2 miles away.
Yeah.
You have to be in the service to do this. It can be a hunting rifle, but you can be a lethal actor. And listen, if I miss, and I'm shooting at a tank or an armored personnel carrier, and that bullet goes by within 6 inches, I promise, as a guy that's had a bullet go by 6 inches from his head, the game changes for you in the receiving, and you're like, there is someone somewhere shooting at us, and maybe someone points and goes towards that building there. But I promise that sniper can be a game-changing thing. And then, like Todd was saying, the real-time feed on where the column is, that kind of thing. You can reliably buy a drone that can shoot 600 apple seeds or 6,000 apple seeds a minute or something dumb like that. It can carry 1,000-pound load. You're talking about the ability for anybody to have a weapon system, even if it's short term. They can do these things and really cause a lot of chaos for a structured military approach with tanks and dismounted infantry.
Yeah, smart targeting technology like the one you described might not be widely available right now in the battlefield of Ukraine, but you know what? It's available. It's a bunch of this, right?
Yep.
So it's another thing that is different from 1991, right? So as the troops of the Russian troops enter adversarial territory, right? Ukrainians, every Ukrainian in the field with a phone in their pocket is now a scout, right? That can immediately record position, the size of the battalion, the size of the convoy, and then upload it either to the internet or to Telegram or to share it. So one of the imbalances that we're seeing, and I don't know if you've noticed, is that we know a lot about Russian troop movement. We don't know a lot about Ukrainians.
Right.
And the reason is that Ukrainians will record everybody, but if it's one of their guys, they will not share that information. So there is a level of interesting OPSEC that goes to saying, well, we used to talk about, well, how hard is to conquer a nation where everybody has a gun, right? Because then you have to conquer every house.
Right.
Well, what do you do in a nation where every citizen has a cell phone? And now they can be feeding, and as long as they have that backbone of the internet, which is why this whole Starlink thing becomes important, and as long as they can still be plugged to some kind of internet-enabled communication, right, they can be sharing troops' positions, they can be coordinating in ways that we haven't seen before, right? So as you say, warfare has been democratized, and a technology, in this case, like the cell phone, becomes a fantastic spying tool that feeds information to NATO allies and the Ukrainian armed forces right there in the ground field. So things have changed.
I'd like to talk a little bit about the asymmetric warfare that's going on. And I know we sort of tipped on it when we were talking about the economic aspect of it. And then, of course, the idea of Anonymous is now playing with hacking into Russian television and playing videos, whether the propaganda or truth, whatever. I guess propaganda is in the eye of the beholder. But I think it's really interesting that this is not just a single battlefield at this point. We are on a battlefield on many points, whether some is bloody and some aren't. But I find that very interesting, specifically in this particular war. What do you think of the asymmetric warfare that's going on, Rodrigo?
So there are two things that what you said. The first one is the idea of the information domain. Now, the information domain is not new. We've been talking about it for a long time. In fact, not only the information domain, but the whole world of cyber, right? To the point that DoD now includes it as one of its military domains, right? Land, sea, air, and cyber. I actually would question if that's a good idea or not, but that's probably the topic for a different conversation. But certainly there is a psychological component of any conflict that goes through the pipes of whatever means of communications exist at the time, right? And today it's not leaflets and newspapers. Today is TikTok and Twitter, right? And we thought, and that was probably true, that the Russians have built their fantastically well-oiled disinformation machine that they unleashed on America during the last cycles of elections. And what we have discovered is that they met in Zelensky, specifically the president of Ukraine, their match, right? Zelensky has been a former media person himself, a comedian who had a very successful TV show before becoming president of Ukraine, has given us these almost made-for-TV or made-for-Twitter scenes of him walking in armor and camouflage in the middle of his commanders and troops, eating with them, and bombarding the internet with these images. He has reinforced the idea of the Ukrainians holding the fort in this David versus Goliath kind of equation. And he has done that by occupying the internet territory and completely obliterating the Russians in that space, right? So the amount of sunflower icons and yellow and blue little flags that you see right now in every profile has been incredible, right? Now, the other element that you see, which is the cyber part of this, which is something that the Russians perfected using their own so-called independent hacker groups that you can then have plausible deniability to say that it was not you. Well, now Anonymous is starting to kind of play that role for Western society, and who else, right? So in this weird dynamic, again, cyber, what it does is that it compresses the field and it democratizes, because anybody with a computer can go and, if they have the knowledge, try to hack a SCADA system of a Russian water plant and try to do something with it, right? So it's another way in which warfare has changed, because I don't think either them or us can claim total control on everybody who has coding skills and might be pissed off about what's happening right now, one way or the other.
I want to back up for a second, and I want to say two things and have you comment on them. You mentioned TikTok, and I'm glad you did, because they're also a player. When I say TikTok and I mean all of the apps that do things like track location. And that means there's data where someone can say, here are how many people with TikTok, and they know a particular percentage of the population. All of a sudden, there's a lot of data as to exactly where people are within 20 feet or whatever the accuracy is. But before all of that, we have waited so long for the Russians to hop in tanks and start driving west. There are, and you know this, Rodrigo, there are thousands of PhDs who have expertise in this area, but they don't ever agree on what's going on. So there's going to be nuclear war. This war is going to expand. It's going to be World War III. And any of these things could actually happen. But there's all this quote unquote expertise, but there's not a lot of agreement on what's going on. And a lot of this expertise is rear looking as opposed to forward thinking,
right?
Where this goes, how we deal with this. So we're getting a lot of hyperbole and fear, but it's not based on the reality of what's going on. So let's talk a little bit about apps and then talk about the overall preponderance of expertise that is probably not oriented in the right direction.
So that's a new element of OPSEC, right? So and there are two ways in which applications can backfire against you, right? One is just the information that you will reveal as you're putting the TikTok together, right? So or the tweet or whatever. And that means that the images that you present can be back engineered and we can geolocate where you are. Bellingcat, so the group, the open source intelligence group, has shown how to do that, and they have shown how some of this information that gets provided might backfire. We saw, for example, rumors during one of the Zelensky videos where somebody claimed, they didn't prove it, I'm not happy they didn't, but somebody claimed that they could identify the location of Zelensky based just on the background that was shown at one point, right? So you have to be careful here. Like loose lips sink ships. That hasn't changed, right? But now that everybody's doing it, right, the potential for an OPSEC challenge, it becomes more important or more prevalent. The second part of this is the metadata, which is what you were mentioning, the metadata and the information that gets generated. TikTok is a Chinese-owned company. They have created a holding to try to kind of divest themselves and give some independence. But it is true that it is owned mostly or operated by a Chinese company that has to respond to Chinese interests, right? So here the bigger conversation would be there is value in the fact that America still dominates the big tech environment, right? That Google is an American company, Facebook is an American company, Apple is an American company. There seems to be a consensus among Republicans and Democrats. It's one of the few things they agree is that they want to limit the power of big tech, right? And that they want to, one way or the other, they want to regulate them and maybe break them apart, right? And I would say to both sides of the aisle here in America, hold your horses.
Yeah.
You might want to be careful, because now we're discovering or remembering that as much as we might not like sometimes what Facebook or Meta, whatever they're called now, or Twitter does, or they're American companies bound by American law, and more importantly, staffed by a lot of Americans or people who share American values, right? So what we're seeing here is that the moment that when things get bad, we appreciate, for example, that Google would immediately turn off the geolocation information that could help Russian troops during their movement, right? TikTok didn't do anything like that because TikTok is a Chinese company, right? So if we want the next whatever big tech platform to be American, this is not just an issue anymore of economic interest. It's actually an issue of national security. Right? There is a reason for us to defend America as the best place to innovate technologically, right? Because that means that those companies will be headquartered here, and it means that we'll follow American regulation and American values.
And that's not new either, though, if you think about it. I mean, like World War II, we were able to turn on the spigot of changing from, designing and building refrigerators to bullets pretty quickly, in our factories. I mean, Westinghouse, which is now an electronic company, became one of the largest gun manufacturers overnight, going from making refrigerators to guns. So I think that's what we've done as a nation, and not saying that we're alone in that. I'm sure other nations do the same thing, but it is important to make sure that we have, manufacturing and intelligence and technology within our country. I agree with that 100%.
Can we talk a little bit about that, the preponderance of knowledge on what was going to happen when Russia went into Ukraine and how divergent that stuff is? Because, everybody has their pet thing. This is going to lead to this. That'll bring in Belarus, which will bring in the Danes, and then a nuclear bomb. And then all of a sudden, and granted, once war starts, you lose control of what war wants to do. But there are a lot of folks who are absolutely wrong about the direction we've gone thus far. And these are really smart people.
Yeah, but I mean, anybody who does military studies knows about the fog of war, right? This is a concept as old as Clausewitz introduced the term, but even before that, Julius Caesar already talked about it. So it is true that once you initiate an armed confrontation, you know how it starts, but you don't know how it ends. Right? You unleash a series of complex dynamics that have a way to interlink with each other, and you lose control of it. I would say that it is wise to be concerned about a direct confrontation between the United States and Russia. We cannot afford to have MiGs and F-35s going to war against each other for obvious reasons, because the potential of escalation is there now. It doesn't mean that escalation cannot happen in other areas, specifically in this economic warfare environment. We'll see where this goes. But it is true that once war starts, you don't know where it ends, right? And there are many forces now interacting with each other, and these forces are pulling the different stakeholders in multiple directions. And the goal of good military planning is actually to provide tools for political victory. Right. So ultimately, a total surrender or a negotiated peace, both are political outcomes of a military engagement. Right. And I worry right now that the off ramps are closing, and right now we're clearly in an escalation move. Right. So yeah. The real challenge here is that we don't have a lot of places to go anymore other than kinetic warfare, because we threw everything we had from the point of view of sanctions and economic retaliation. So it's funny to see, it's not funny, it's scary, but to see Twitter, for example, obsessing with the idea of a no-fly zone on top of Ukraine staffed by NATO troops, right? Like if a no-fly zone would be a magical umbrella that made out of unicorns and rainbows, right? So no, a no-fly zone is basically military hardware that would try to interdict the access to airspace to Russian aircraft. Are we really ready to throw a Stinger missile to a Russian aircraft if they violate the? Of course we're not, or we shouldn't. So that's where we are right now. I'm hoping that cold heads will prevail. That's always the hope that one has. But it is clear right now that the world is on a dynamic that we haven't seen since probably the end of at least the Cold War, and some people might actually put that one beyond that to the end of the Second World War, in which two highly capable nuclear superpowers are tiptoeing around the military campaign of conquest of a neighboring territory on the former Soviet sphere of influence.
Could we see? This just popped into my head. Could we see like a resurgent or a modern version of the Flying Tigers? I mean, is there a possibility of being able to get a hold of?
So we saw the temptation. A version of that would be of transferring. So Poland and other former communist countries who still operate MiG-29s in their air forces, they were tempted to share with them the aircraft with the Ukrainians, and they backtracked because they thought that could be seen as being arming that would cross a line. We're even seeing some citizens from different countries going to Ukraine. Yeah. Veterans from special forces going there. You have to be very careful with that one. So Putin cannot frame it as a backdoor for military intervention by third party. And within Ukraine, I mean, what you're seeing is the growth of a new mythology, right? So the ghost of Kiev, for example, who is creating all these new narratives that, if anything, they are reinforcing the national identity of the Ukrainians. So if Putin's argument was that Ukraine was not a nation because they were part of Russia and we are one and the same, which is what he said both in that letter, in that op-ed that he published, but also in his speech to justify the operations, what he's doing here is reinforcing. Nothing does better. Nothing works better to reinforce your national identity than having a common enemy, right? So every tank in Ukrainian territory reminds Ukrainians why they want to be independent and why they want to be a nation separate from the sphere of influence of Russia and Moscow.
When we look at the campaigns going on, you know, the go fuck yourself guys on Snake Island, all of these things, we're also we are absolutely losing track of what Ukraine was before this whole thing started, and they were not an angel. No. They have their own things, but we're just like because Hollywood hates Nazis and uses them as the heels of history, you lose track of the atrocities that the Japanese committed in World War II and the Americans committed in World War II, right? We just think about the Nazis. So are we going to lose track of what Ukraine was before the war because they were the attacked? And are we going to forgive them for the things that they were doing that we all would agree are at best questionable?
So Ukraine is an interesting country right now because they are, and Zelensky in particular, they're in a process of really fighting against the corruption problems that they have, endemic corruption problems that are not unique to them. They are part of the post-Soviet space, right? So one of the reasons why we're seeing, and I mean, it's normal during a attack of this magnitude to have a crying rally of solidarity, right? And we're seeing in this case, for example, Ukraine and the Ukrainian people moving to reinforce their ties to the West with elements as, for example, requesting admission into the European Union, right? Something that they've been dreaming about for ages, but the EU had been very clear up to this point that until they fix their corruption problems, they would not be eligible to become even a candidate to admission. That has changed right now. So it is, to your point, it is interesting how in this fracture, in this crisis, and Europe has built itself, the European Union has built itself through multiple series of crises. So it's not surprising. But through this crisis, we're seeing, again, an effort to reimagine what the relationship with Europe could be. Now, this is very dangerous because it actually changes and alters the balance of power. It's always like teasing Putin and saying, okay, you didn't want Europe in your backdoor. Now we're going to even give Ukraine a candidacy for joining the European
Right.
Union, right? So we're doubling down into it, right? And this is where I was saying we have to be looking for the off-ramps, and we have to be very clear that there is no, unless something weird happens, there is no unconditional surrender at the end of this conflict. Russia is just too powerful, and that's their backyard, right? So we have to be careful to leave space for diplomacy to take place and the opportunity for de-escalation if it presents itself, right?
I have a question for both you and both Rodrigo and Pete, because so I was reading this piece, and they were talking about the fact it was a former spy type guy, and he was talking about the fact that Putin had to go into the breakaway regions that started this whole thing, I guess, for lack of a better term, because he needed to show strength to his inner circle. That if he didn't show strength to his inner circle, that they would probably, at some point here in the near future, ice him out, right? Whether they would vote him out, whatever that means in Russia, or kill him, I guess, on the other side of it. Is this a move, do you think, that Putin did because he is under pressure in his own circle, or is this something that he's been planning for a long time? You know, like this is the word I'm kind of confused about, like why this actually escalated so quickly compared to what the media was showing.
Yeah, so I mean, the problem with political science and international relations and national security studies is that they might be able to tell you what big trends and big numbers mean, but it's very hard to do psychology of a single individual, right? So the tension between Ukraine and Russia is not new. I mean, it is as old as the existence of these nation states, right? This is a geography plays a role. This is a area, a flat land with big open fields that cannot be secured by mountains or rivers. So it's always been the Achilles heel of Central Europe, and the geopolitical fear of Russia has always been the capacity to mobilize troops through the Donbas area and create this land bridge that would penetrate to the heart of Russia, right? So this is the whole thing about Russia without Ukraine is a nation. Russia with Ukraine is an empire, right? Many people have said things on that vein. So the historical tension of Ukraine, or we call Ukraine today, although it has been multiple different kind of states and kingdoms, right? But that space has always played an interesting buffer state role in the stabilization of the conflict of big empires in Europe. What is new here is that we thought that was behind us, right? We thought that we were done with conquest wars in Europe, right? And we're not, right? And Putin has been carving parts of the former Soviet space since at least 2008. So It's certainly not something new, where Crimea was the most aggressive one, but it was not the only one. He's done this in multiple other Georgia, and even if you think Belarus, I mean, he clearly showed this case that he needed battalions to conquer Belarus, to conquer Ukraine. He didn't need anything to conquer Belarus, right? We can see how they are operating as a satellite state. And so what I would say here is this is not new. It's not a new phenomenon. What might have been surprising was this decision, and this goes to the speculation that you mentioned, this decision to why now? Why in 2022 to suddenly move 180,000 troops and commit them to a land operation to conquer not only a small chunk of Ukraine, but actually go into a whole regime change effort to either decapitate the government of Ukraine or to even annex big chunks of the country. And there's a lot of speculation here. A lot of these discussions have had to do with the internal affairs of Putin and his position within. Well, I try to stay away from that kind of thing, because either there is intelligence that is not being shared, and then we don't have it, right? Or there is no intelligence, and this is pure speculation, right? So clearly he thought this was beneficial for his position in history and for his trying to do, right? And we will see if this backfires beyond what he expected. Nobody clearly thought that this would be the extent of the West response to the issue. And what we know is that both the troops, so because we have now interviews that have been performed to capture POWs from the Russian side, they were not given the right amount of intelligence to know what was happening, and they didn't think they were moving into this kind of warfare that they were thrown. And a lot of these are conscripts with very low levels of training.
Right.
The Russian people did not expect it. I mean, most of the people laughed about the idea of a full war with Ukraine. And interestingly enough, when the CIA and the Biden administration started to kind of express their alarm, many people considered that they were being over dramatic, including Zelensky.
Yeah.
Right?
I have a friend of mine who lives in Ukraine, and when we were getting this information, I was sharing it with him. He's like, "This is all overblown. This is only in the Western media. We're here. We're going to karaoke tonight." I mean, he literally the day before the invasion, he was out at a karaoke bar. I woke him up at 5:30 in the morning and said, "Hey, are you guys okay? I hear they're bombing the Capitol." He's like, "It's 5:30 in the morning, man. I'll let you know when I wake up." I'm like, "Dude, they are bombing the Capitol. You need to move now." And so now he finally just got out. He's in Poland right now, but it was a crazy few days for him.
No, it's been interesting to see how fast everybody has been quoting now Lenin, which cracks me up. This whole thing about there are decades where nothing happens and there are days where decades happen, right? So, well, warfare is like that. But again, we were used to, at least for this not to happen anymore in this theater, right? We know that. I mean, this is how fast Damascus went to war, right? So, but we didn't expect this to happen in the backyard of the European Union, in the neighborhood of Russia, right? And we're now rediscovering why conventional warfare still matters and why alliances like NATO are still important.
When we look at the off ramps, right? These are big things, and we often don't like the off ramp, but we need someone to take an off ramp at some point. So one question I have for you is, and I'll just say, just to make the conversation happen a little bit, I think we've passed this point, but have we passed the point where Putin can remain in power in 6 months, 2 years, whatever that is time? And then if we're going to build an off ramp for Putin, are we going to build one with a carrot or a stick? Because if you give the man $100 million, I don't know that he even cares about $100 million. He's got so much money already. But do we furnish him with a very nice, soft, cushy, go to the Emirates, here's all these ladies, here's all this money, and let him go and retire? Or do we start hitting assets with physical bombs and start to destabilize Russia as a state?
So I don't think the Russians will let him retire like that. They're going to end up killing him.
Well, that's up to them. I'm just saying we need to have an off ramp that we provide,
So
and I mean the world.
With the caveat that I am not a specialist of the Russian political system, I am a specialist of geopolitics and geostrategy, right? And what I would say here is that we're seeing here a multiscalar. Well, there's multiscalarity, right? So there are multiscalar series of systems embedded with each other, right? One is, of course, the evident one, which is the tactical deployment of Russian military forces in Ukrainian territory. That's the one playing in front of us. We have then at the global scale, we have now the NATO alliance and the NATO aligned countries that are supporting the sanction regime against Russia. And then at the domestic level of Russia, we have what is going to be a very punitive sanctions that will be felt both by the oligarchs and the people on the street. I mean, any 40-year-old, any 35-year-old kid, any 35-year-old adult that it's right now unable to use his Apple Pay and Spotify. See, this is people who grew up during the post-Soviet era that saw a growth of the Russian economy and an integration of the Russian economy into the world arena, and they now vacation in Mallorca in Spain and go shopping in the streets of Munich for their high-end stuff, and they have some beautiful neighborhoods in Moscow with Starbucks and all of the brands that we associate with American consumerism, right? That suddenly are being sent to a status of pariah state worse than Iran, probably at the level of North Korea.
Yeah.
Right? So how will that fragile middle class react to that new status? Right now, this is a police state. Putin has worked the last 8 years to make it sure that opposition gets crushed. Navalny, the biggest opposition leader, is now in prison. They're giving him another 20 years of prison for whatever reason they could find. They try to poison him inside. So this is a country where you cannot just go and like BLM here in America or the Tea Party, just start rallying in the middle of a square and hope that nothing happens. There's more than 10,000 arrests apparently already of people rallying on the streets of Russia. 10,000 arrests, right? So how many people should have been rallying? So you end up with 10,000 people behind bars.
Right.
And we have heard very timid voices, both by political leaders affiliated or close to Putin and some of the oligarchs and influencers saying that they want to see the war stop, right? So will there be enough pressure? Well, you asked the question, right? Well, that depends on what Putin considers this to be. If he feels that he can survive better with finding a kind of diplomatic accommodation, or if he feels that this is it, and he's with his back against the wall. I think that that's a position we need to avoid. When you are in the position of being the owner and under control of the second most powerful nuclear arsenal, maybe the first one by the number of warheads, you don't want to give that individual the feeling that he has no escape, right? So, and that's kind of what we are.
Is his back against the wall?
Well, it might be if there's no way for him to get out of this, and he feels that the only place for him to go is to send more tanks and more armament, and at one point even put on the table, as he has done already, rattling the rattle of nuclear warfare, right? So we need to be very careful to make sure that we always feel and will always leave a space for de-escalation, right? While at the same time showcasing that we are decided and we're not backing down, at least from what is the basic principles of the modern international regime, which is that territories of nation states should be respected, right? So
we also don't want Russia to destabilize to the point where that nuclear arsenal comes into play over and over again as they try to sort through which leader is going to survive, because that's the most, we're talking about nuclear war, boy, that's the most likely thing to cause one, is a destabilized Russia.
And I want to add to that, Pete, because that's exactly what I was going to say. Is that I read a book a few years ago. I forget the name of the guy who wrote it, and I feel bad now. It was this guy who worked for the Pentagon. He was military officer, PhD guy, in economics, and he has the book was all about how back in the 80s and 90s, we had an economic warfare plan already laid out. It sounds like we're implementing this, but if we're hurting these players economically speaking, if Putin can't access his money or his oligarchy can't access their money, does that move it? Does that escalate it into nuclear warfare at that point?
So the truth is that we could have never punished the Soviet Union with the tools that we're using right now, because the Soviet Union was not part of the global stage the way the Russia is, right? As a communist country, it didn't have a stock market the way we see today. It didn't have integration with the banking system. In many ways, the Iron Curtain was the buffer that kept the two blocks separate. One of the things that has happened is that Russia moved completely into the world financial system after the fall of the Soviet Union, and not only moved, but it moved successfully.
Rodrigo, the fall of the Soviet Union could be brought back to economics, right? Because number one, the Star Wars, spending money that we outspend them on arms, and then two, they got involved with Afghanistan, which depleted their economy, so they were economically starving at that point.
We need a whole other podcast just to discuss the reasons behind the fall of the Soviet Union.
Right.
Star Wars has been somewhat overhyped as the trigger, but it certainly had a role. Dynamics within Germany, and East Germany had a role to play too. The intention when the Berlin Wall fell, right? The intention was to normalize some of the relationship. It was not to just completely break the German state that later on triggered some of the other cascading. And that's kind of the point that we made at the beginning. Cascading effects are very important in warfare and in general in politics. And the problem with that is that they are unpredictable. These are complex adaptive systems, right? So once you trigger one event, it might initiate a dynamic that nobody controls completely, right? And clearly, a destabilized Russia is not on the best interest of stability of the world, but at the same time, not destabilizing Russia isn't either right now, because the alternative to that would be actual military confrontation and the risk of escalation, right? So, I mean, in a perfect scenario, if I had my magic wand, what you want is for the adults in the room, in every room, to sit together and find a damn diplomatic solution to what is now a very complicated event. I would say this. I think that, I mean, the Russians don't want nuclear warfare as we don't either. It is part of their military doctrine to kind of look mad and make it always plausible that they would use the nuclear option. We've seen that one since the time of the Soviets, and for what we know for their current military doctrine, that still stands to be true. I think that the challenge here is to find what is something that Putin could use to save face, to say that this was a military victory, and at the same time, it's acceptable both for the European Union, Ukraine, and the United States. And what that is, I mean, offering assurances that Ukraine will not join NATO didn't seem to be enough. The EU will never accept to say that Ukraine will never be part of the European Union, because that would be giving a veto power to Russia about which nations get to join or not.
Right.
So it is not clear to me what is the alternative, and I'm thinking that Ukraine would not accept a partition of the Donbas region for it to become part of Russia, right? So given that those are the things on the table right now, I'm hoping that through back channels, smart diplomats and military affairs people are talking to each other, trying to find a way to escape this circumstance right now, because if not, the alternative is right now to continue the escalatory movements.
We're at a point right now where the weather and geography is going to start to have a real impact on Russia's ability to provision its own people. It's not gone well. Okay, conscripts, great. If your service force, though, is already demoralized, it's going to be really, really tough for them to advance this. And so it seems at least a third of the possible outcomes is a protracted stalemate.
Yeah, and we're starting to see some of that.
Yeah.
Right? So this what we know, and there's at this point, this has even been discussed by military planners openly, American military planners. What we saw is that what's the idea of a fast-moving blitzkrieg from a pincer maneuver to decapitate Kyiv didn't work, right? Yeah. So it wasn't fast already, right? And again, one of the challenges here, imagine that suddenly America started to invade Canada, and we had troops in Ontario and in Quebec. And well, the problem with that is that Americans kind of sort of like Canadians, right? Yeah. So we play hockey together, we marry each other, we go to holidays, we share. So a lot of Russians have a deep sense of love and appreciation for Ukraine. And it is one thing to feel that you're going through a rapid maneuver to protect ethnic Russians and Russian-speaking people in Ukraine, and another very different to see this shelling, indiscriminate shelling of a former Soviet highly dense building in Kyiv, where you're killing hundreds of civilians, much of which have relationships with Russian citizens, right? So the idea of a long siege of Kyiv, which is what's starting to look like, it plays again to the issue of domestic politics within the Russian sphere. And the other thing is, I don't even know if Russia right now, under the sanctions will have the capacity to at the same time stabilize its economy and wage a very expensive war in Ukraine for the long run. Now, we have allowed them to continue selling natural gas and oil because we need them, right? Because if you don't, if you remove the gas production of Russia, parts of Europe, Germany, and Poland would freeze during this winter, and we would see a skyrocketing price. You saw yesterday President Biden during the State of the Union how much he really tried to make it clear that there wouldn't be an increase, or that we were doing everything in our power to see that there is not an increase of gasoline for Americans. That's going to happen, right? It's happening already. It was even happening before. The more we destabilize what is a highly important oil and gas, especially natural gas producer, the more we'll see fluctuation in international energy markets. And frankly, I think that this is one of those cases where Americans should be prepared to that no conflict is costless, and some of that cost will come in higher energy prices for the West.
Yeah, I mean the oil reserve that he let go is something like 3 or 4 days worth of gas. It's nothing.
Yeah.
No, they have so releasing oil barrels from the oil reserve have short-term impact, and it tends to have more of a geopolitical and symbolic role that can bring some of that pressure down. But yeah, ultimately, if Russia was really offline, it's not right now. The other part that we haven't discussed, by the way, is the provision of grains, right? Both Ukraine and Russia are heavy grains producers, of which many African and Eastern European countries depend for their food security.
Did you see the price of corn?
Yeah. So
holy smoke! I never thought I'd see corn close to $1,000 a bushel. You know, I mean, it's like the future.
The same will happen with wheat.
Yeah.
Right? So warfare at the global level is not costless, and that's the problem, right? That once all these things start to happen, this is how we ended up in First World War and in Second World War, right? When we created the post-American regime after the Second World War, and we saw the Pax Americana with the international institutions and kind of the devaluation of nationalisms. Well, this is what we were trying to avoid. One of the things that a lot of us have been worrying about since we saw the growth of new versions of nationalisms globally was that we know where that takes us, right? Every time that the world has gone through a dramatic dynamic of increase on jingoism and what we call illiberal nationalism, it doesn't take much for one place or the other, two of those nationalisms to collide and that collision to create conflict. And I mean, out of all of those, Putin is the mastermind of a lot of these illiberal nationalists around the globe. So we're now seeing what happens when those forces are exacerbated. And as I said before, the hope here is that there is no unconditional surrender of Russia. That's not going to happen. So the hope here is that we're leaving space for this de-escalation to take place. But right now we're not seeing it yet.
Yeah,
some interesting things about these were facts about the situation. Riga, which is the capital of Latvia, is about 400 miles from St. Petersburg, Russia. Krakow to Moscow, 1,000 miles. It's
right.
Just not that far, right? And the size of Russia, population-wise, is not that big compared to, say, Russia, Poland, and Ukraine working together. It's just not that. Russia has, let's call it 125 million people, and Ukraine has 50 million people, 40 million, something like that. So the disparity is not the size of Russia in land. It's a fairly manageable difference in the population, maybe money, but there's more people on Ukraine's side, right? You take the Baltics, they're always glad to chip in. Poland not only is ready to fight, they probably are fighting in as many ways as they legally can. This gets to be a real problem for Russia because you can't protect St. Petersburg, Moscow, and in the summertime, you absolutely can roll into those places and cause a lot of damage.
Yeah, the long-term impact of this for Russia is going to be important because there's even if the war ended tomorrow in stalemate and nothing for what Russia has shown is that this can happen again, right? You might remember the debate that we had here in America when the Congress was hesitating to raise the debt ceiling, right? And we said, well, if you don't do it, the question is not about now, it's what happens 30 years into the future. Well, multiply that times 10, right? So today, if you are a company that's used to doing trade with Russia, now you're saying, holy cow, what's the next crazy war that you're going to go through that is going to put my assets and my people and my company in the crosshairs of this ridiculous geopolitical kabuki theater, right? So the impact for the idea of Russia as a mid-sized power in the concert of nations equal to other it's gone. I mean, I'm not kidding to say that the kind of sanctions that we're imposing is putting them right now at the level of North Korea. Now they're not North Korea, and China is behind them, kind of like they are behind North Korea. But this idea of a modern Russia with a modern stock market and modern jobs with startups and dynamic, well, it's going down the drain by the minute. Right. So the soft power of Russia is being eroded like we haven't seen to happen to any modern nation probably ever. Right?
And this is why I asked the question, why now? Like what is Putin doing? Why he wants to do that? Because it just does not make economic sense to me.
You don't invade unless you think you can win. And he got convinced he could win.
Well, he thought that he actually thought that the military would turn around on Zelensky and become a military dictatorship quickly.
I'll say one thing without doing the whole conspiracy theory, right? I worry. Yeah. So he's clearly terrified of COVID, right? You've seen these press conferences where he has everybody like 50 feet apart, and he's there. You saw the table where he hosted Emmanuel Macron and the Chancellor of Germany. You saw the interviews with his generals where he's sitting here, and I honestly, I mean, I don't know how you conduct a war as the main strategist when you're keeping your person, anybody you see 50 feet away from you, and anybody who wants to have a meeting with you apparently has to quarantine for 2 weeks in a hotel that he controls.
Did he have COVID?
I don't think so. And I don't know if it's just COVID. I don't know if this is something that dictators go through.
Dr. Evil. He's going to do everything via VTC.
So that becomes a very interesting way of wage war that does tell you something about the person who's in command, right?
Right.
A lot of Putin's students, right? A lot of people who have studied Putin, and I've read, right, probably at this point every paper of every reputable expert in the rise of Putin to power, are asking the same question, right? And there are many explanations from his view of history and his obsession with re-establishing the sphere of influence in what he has called the worst geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century, who was the fall of the Soviet Union. It might be that he saw the opportunity. Again, it's not new. He's been carving territories for a long time. It might be that he saw a threat in Zelensky, that he is a young, dynamic leader that has actually been successful at selling the idea of democracy, of rule of law to a lot of Ukrainians, many of them neighboring Russia. So be what it may, right? I think how Pete said it, well, he felt he could win, right? He was sold on the idea that this could be an operation that would be done before the West would have had the time to react, which is kind of what happened both in Georgia and Crimea.
Right.
And it didn't.
Oh,
right?
Well, with Georgia and Crimea, did we have the willingness to act?
Well, we clearly didn't, right? Because we didn't. But the other issue is, could we have acted, right? One of the things that are different here is that the Ukraine of 2022 is not the Ukraine of 2014.
That's what I was about to ask.
Right? Yeah. So they rebuild. I mean, the defense that they have established. So it's like any conflict with two parties. It's a mix of bad offense and good defense, right? But the defense that the Ukrainian armed forces and Ukrainian people have mounted is nothing short of heroic.
Heroic, right? Well, the president who was in the Ukraine at the Ukraine, I don't know why I keep adding that to it. In Ukraine prior to during Crimea was realistically a Putin puppet, right? I mean, or at least a very sympathizer of Putin.
So you might remember that the previous European-leaning president of Ukraine was also poisoned by
right. That's right. Yeah.
So, yeah, it's a really bad job, right? So the life expectancy of the president of Ukraine hasn't been great recently. So yeah, there's been a big effort, and this is clear because he has spoken. So again, it's no conspiracy. Part of the guiding principle of the grand strategy of Russia has been to recreate the sphere of influence lost with the fall of the Soviet Union. And it is clear that Zelensky, his victory, and then his politics made it clear that the bet that Ukraine was placing was with the West, right? That where they're trying to move was the West. Now, Putin didn't have to invade for that, right? There are many ways in which he could have played his soft power to try to increase the level of carrots and try to bring back Ukraine to the fold. Apparently, he decided that he couldn't anymore, that he had lost that battle, and that now Ukraine was clearly gravitating towards the European side of the Iron Curtain, and he decided that the only thing he could do at this point was to intervene militarily to keep what he considered strategic territories within the sphere of control of Moscow.
What about China?
No. Well,
You asked, what about China at 1 hour?
Yeah. Well, I'll say this: you might have noticed that in this whole ordeal, when Putin was keeping leaders at a football field distance from him, the one leader he allowed to be photographed with him, shoulder to shoulder, was Xi Jinping. Right, so he has made it very clear that he needs them, right? And China is in this very uncomfortable position, while at the same time supporting what is basically an ally in their posture against the United States, but at the same time not wanting to make or signal that it's okay to take chunks of territory from other countries and willy-nilly and nothing happens. I mean, they people think a lot about Taiwan right now, and we should. The Chinese also remember Tibet, right, and other territories within their country. So China is in a very weird position where they are always happy to see America and NATO maybe in a defensive posture, but at the same time, they're having to. It's like making excuses for your drunk uncle, right? that you like, but you know that that's Russia for China right now.
Yeah, well, speaking of drunk uncles, I'm going to go grab a beer and then relax for a little bit this afternoon. Todd, thanks for coming and hanging out, man. We actually have to go get a beer in person.
Absolutely.
And then Rodrigo, just for me closing up, hey, thank you so much for coming on. This is great. I love having different voices on. We didn't even get into the future stuff very much. We'll have to have you come back on and talk about that. But this is what a perfect time to have someone like you come on because of what you do. And there's so much more for everybody that Rodrigo does. Todd, give us your final thoughts. And then Rodrigo, you follow up with Todd, and then I'll close things down.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I've been paying attention to this. I mean, because of personal connections to the country, since, Russia kind of started moving things on the border. Very, very an issue that we were going to be having with this as an emergency manager. I know people that are on the ground already. Kyle King, with capacity builders over there. Jesse Levitt went over there right now, doing some work, specifically trying to get aid to people. For those that are over there that are doing that work, keep your head down, stay safe, and we do appreciate it. This is a humanitarian crisis, no matter what happens geopolitically, and we're going to have to be dealing with this for decades. So there's going to be a lot of work ahead of us. Thank you.
Yeah. So one dimension we didn't talk about is that of domestic politics of the United States, right? And what I would say is that this is a moment of truth to us, right? Because we could afford our culture wars nonsense and are hating the Democrats and Republicans and libtards without an adversary the size of Russia acting in the world stage the way they are right now. This is a moment for America and Americans to get our act together, right? So we don't need to agree with each other. We've never had. In fact, part of the virtue of America is that we through division, through democracy, we process that division, and that makes us better, right? We compete with each other. But we used to say that politics end at the shoreline, right? And it is important right now to understand that we need to put to put together a common front, especially that with the midterms, it's very probable that the Democrats will lose at least one of the two houses in Congress, maybe both. So it's a moment for political elites, both from both parties, to start acting like adults and put the interest of the American nation state before the interest of their respective communities.
I love it. Stand by.